Hello everyone, it's Michael from Replica Airguns with an informational video for you. Today we're going to talk primarily about uncontrolled firearms in Canada. What exactly are they? What falls into this category? Like, what are replicas? What about BB machine guns? What are the legal ramifications of all of these things within Canada? Do you need licenses for these guns? All that kind of stuff. So if you're from the US or if you're from other parts of the world, this doesn't really apply to you, but you may find it kind of interesting, and you may wonder what in the world our bureaucrats and politicians are doing out here. But anyways, this is how it is, and these are the rules and regulations according to our Firearms Act here in Canada. So I have a lot of quotes, a lot of stuffy information I'm going to be reading. I've tried to go through a lot of these memorandums that you can find on the CBSA, which is our customs agency, their website, and the RCMP website, which is our main police detachment here in Canada. It's our government police, the RCMP. So we'll start off here. Let's talk about some of the main points. Again, I'm going to be reading a lot of this, so bear with me. So uncontrolled firearms do not require a firearms license within Canada to own or operate, which is kind of cool about uncontrolled firearms versus controlled. Controlled being that you need a firearms license. Anyways, let's get into some more stuff here. Uncontrolled air guns and airsoft guns. So we're going to talk about the uncontrolled air guns and airsoft guns. We're going to also talk about uncontrolled blank guns, starter pistols. We're going to also talk about fully automatic air guns, because in Canada we're not allowed full auto guns. So how do we get full auto BB guns and airsoft guns? We'll go into that a little bit. We're also going to talk about replica guns, because in Canada we're not allowed replica guns. And I get that question all the time. How can you have a replica air gun, yet in Canada you're not allowed replica guns? So some of this stuffy legal stuff I'm going to read is going to, in legal speak, talk about that. I'll try to sort of, at the end of each little part that I read, I'll try to put it into my own words. Again, this is just my take on it. This is how I understand it, being part of this industry, been selling these guns for a long time. But again, this is just my take on it, my personal opinion, how I understand this from what other people have said to me, from my operating and importing things myself into Canada and selling them, and all of that kind of stuff. So another thing I want to talk about here, a little note. If you are going to own or purchase a controlled firearm, you'll need a POL, which is a possession only license, or a PAL, which is a possession acquisition license if you want to buy new guns, or an RPAL, which is a restricted possession acquisition license. There's also prohibited PALs, which allow you to have these grandfathered in prohibited weapons, and that could be the short-barreled pistols, and in some cases even machine guns within Canada if you owned one prior to these gun laws being changed. Alright, so this memorandum D19-13-2 is located on the CBSA website. I'll put a link within the description of this video to this memorandum and on my website, where I'm going to post the written version of this video. Alright, so let's get into all this legal written stuff that I've pulled out of the memorandum. So anyways, firearm. What is a firearm? A barreled weapon from which any shot, bullet, or other projectile can be discharged, and that is capable of causing serious bodily injury or death to a person. That's very important, and includes any frame or receiver of such a barreled weapon, and anything that can be adapted for use as a firearm. So that's another thing that's important. Can it cause serious injury or death? And you'll also notice that they've talked about the frame, receiver, and barrel. Very important, because these parts are how we determine what is the firearm, specifically the frame or the receiver. That's what's registered, and that's what is the firearm. So in some cases with some blank guns, they were uncontrolled firearms or non-guns, but because the frame was determined to be from a real gun or a gun that could fire in objects, whether they be rubber bullets or what have you, these guns were considered prohibited. Alright, so let's get into the uncontrolled firearms, which is really important to what we're talking about today, because that's really what we're dealing with here at Replica Airguns, is the uncontrolled firearms. Uncontrolled firearms are those devices that, although falling within the definition of a firearm in the criminal code, are exempt from specific legal requirements of the Firearms Act and its regulations, as well as from other legislative provisions. Uncontrolled firearms should not be subdivided into any non-restricted, restricted, or prohibited classes. That's really important. Again, if it's an uncontrolled firearm, there is no prohibited. So if it's full auto, it's not going to matter. There is no, oh, it's a short barrel, uncontrolled gun, so that makes it prohibited. because a lot of our replica guns that we have here are air guns, or uncontrolled firearms if you want to call them that, are short barreled. Some of them are full auto. If they were controlled firearms, they would be prohibited because of that. The following types of firearms are deemed uncontrolled: flare blank rivet and industrial guns. Any device that is designed exclusively for signaling, for notifying of distress, or for firing blank cartridges, or for firing stud cartridges, explosive-driven rivets, or other industrial projectiles, provided that the importer intends to use it only for the purpose of which it is designed. So, how are we able to sell blank guns in Canada? Because some of them, or some people would consider them replicas. Well, the laws have kind of changed. We used to be able to get a lot more varieties of blank guns, but I think what really happened is some of them were maybe too close to the look of other guns in production. Like for instance, this Rite Baron, which was brought into Canada at one point, looks a lot like a SIG, short-barreled SIG P228, I believe, or whatever it is, 226. Very similar, maybe too close, and so it was basically not allowed to be brought in anymore. So Rites weren't allowed to be brought in anymore. A lot of the Echo guns, pretty much all of those types of guns that were very similar to guns in production, although they were flare guns, they shot flares, they made a big bang, they could be classified as signal flare guns. They kind of crossed over a little bit into that whole replica side. Now we do sell the ROM guns, and here is one version. Now the line is so fine, it's really hard to decide or to tell, like, how come this one is allowed in Canada? We sell this on the Replica Airguns website. How come this is? It looks like, I guess you'd call it a J frame. I could be wrong, but it looks like, you know, your old Smith & Wesson pistol, right? Like you'd find. Would you call it a replica? I don't know, right? It's just a standard revolver. So, you know, this one shoots 380 caliber or 9mm blanks, and that's what it shoots. Right, nice little gun, all metal gun. Is it a replica? I don't know. Now this gun here, this is another ROM gun that we have, RG88. And what does it look like? Well, maybe it looks like a PPK, maybe it looks like a Makarov, maybe it looks a little bit like both of them, but not any one in particular. So it's allowed in. There are some other ROM guns that we can't bring in because they look too close to other guns in production. There's like an HK replica that ROM sells. We can't bring it in because it really looks pretty much bang on like the HK gun. So we can't bring that one in. Now, getting a little further on that subject of toy guns and starter pistols and all that, toy guns and starter pistols do not generally qualify as firearms. However, some toy or model guns and starter pistols may be designed with very realistic mechanisms or appearances, e.g. color, size, scale, translucency, so not being translucent, and resembling a real make and model of firearm. So that's key, resembling a real make and model. In such cases, they may be considered replica firearms, and even if they are made of plastic, die-cast zinc, or other materials. So there again, if it's too close to the real gun, like in the case of this Rite, you could say it looks very close to a SIG, then it's basically crossing over that boundary. And the good people over at CBSA have determined that that one is too much like a replica. So I guess they're the ones that draw the line, and these guys are okay. And by the way, you might be wondering what this gun is. I just thought I'd throw a real gun in here just to throw it on the table. I mean, a lot of these guns pretty much all look, like real guns. And here, in fact, we have a real gun. And by the way, the barrel, I have safety checked this gun, and I don't even have a magazine or any rounds around, so just so you know. Alright, let's talk about another thing that makes a gun an uncontrolled gun. Low muzzle velocity or energy. So any barreled weapon that is not designed or adapted to discharge projectiles at muzzle velocities exceeding 152.4 meters per second or 500 feet per second, and at a muzzle energy exceeding 5.7 joules, which by the way is 4.2 foot-pounds, or to discharge projectiles that are designed or adapted to attain a velocity exceeding 152.4 meters per second or 500 feet per second, and an energy exceeding 5.7 joules, again, which is 4.2 foot-pounds. Both, now this is key, both thresholds of 152.4 meters per second and 5.7 joules must be exceeded for the firearm to be considered controlled. This requirement exempts firearms that fire below the threshold velocity with a standard projectile but exceed the threshold velocity, which is 500 feet per second, when fired with high velocity projectiles. Now this one really bugs me because there's a lot of guns that what they do is they'll put on the package 525 feet per second with high velocity rounds or whatever. And so the customs agents see that and they go, oh, it's over 500 feet per second. Because to be honest, a lot of these guys really don't know the details of their own laws. They just kind of know the basic stuff. Oh, 500 feet per second, can't have it if it goes over that. You can have it if you show the right paperwork, right? So in the case of a rifle, all I need to do is show them my PAL license and I can bring it in. If it's a pistol, I would have to go through other requirements and get a short-term authorization to transport it from the border and make sure that it's properly registered and all that stuff if it were a pistol. But because uncontrolled firearms don't require that, that's not necessary. So getting back to this whole 500 feet per second thing, again, both thresholds have to be exceeded. You have to exceed 500 feet per second and 5.7 joules. So you can exceed 5.7 joules, but not 500 feet per second, using the standard ammunition that was made for that gun. You can also exceed 500 feet per second as long as it doesn't go over 5.7 joules. So in the case of airsoft BBs, they could be doing 700 feet per second and probably still not exceed 5.7 joules. So I'm not sure what the math is. You'd have to do the math and figure out feet per second versus a gram of the BBs to figure out what the energy is. But what I'm saying here is you can go well over 500 feet per second with an airsoft gun and not exceed 5.7 joules. Even with a 4.5 millimeter BB, you can still shoot well over 500 feet per second because they're really just over 3 grams. So they're about 5.1 grain, I believe. And so they can get up close to 600 feet per second before they actually go over that 5.7 joules. So again, BB guns shooting over 500 feet per second, like the steel BB ones, isn't a big deal. It's still legal. It's still uncontrolled here in Canada. And sometimes you have to show the customs agents their own memorandum to show them that, in fact, you can have an airgun that shoots over 500 feet per second. All right, getting a little bit into airsoft guns. Airsoft guns and certain types of paintball guns or markers may qualify as a replica firearm if the muzzle velocity of the projectile does not cause serious bodily harm, and their external features are clearly designed to resemble a specific and readily identifiable make and model of firearm. To be considered a firearm within the meaning of the criminal code, an airsoft gun must have a muzzle velocity in excess of 111.6 meters per second, which is 366 feet per second. Now, keep in mind, this was determined to be the feet per second that can cause serious injury. And again, a firearm in Canada, according to our Firearms Act, is something that can cause serious injury, bodily harm, or even death. And so it's been determined that 366 feet per second is the speed in which an airsoft BB must travel to do so. So therefore, it cannot be a replica at the same time as it is a firearm according to our Firearms Act. So I hope you understand this. This is what determines why a BB gun can be quote-unquote a replica or not, is the fact that it's not. How can it be a replica if according to our Firearms Act, it's a firearm? And our Firearms Act doesn't say that, okay, just because the gun is uncontrolled, it can't be a replica. It's either a firearm, uncontrolled, controlled, doesn't matter. So it's either a firearm or it's not a firearm. If it's not a firearm, if it can't cause serious injury, then it can't be a replica. I also want to make a note that the memorandum a while back used to state that it had to be a .20 gram BB traveling at 366 feet per second, but I cannot find that anywhere in the memorandum anymore. So it seems any weight BB, so it could even be a .15 gram BB or what have you, as long as it's traveling 366 feet per second or faster, then that gun is determined to cause serious injury, and that gun is then determined to be a firearm. Even though it's uncontrolled, it can still be a replica, quote unquote. I know this is going on, but it's got to be done. Alright, so let's get into what is a replica firearm. Replica firearm is defined as any device that is designed or intended to exactly resemble or to resemble with near precision a firearm, and that itself is not a firearm but does not include any such device that is designed or intended to exactly resemble or to resemble with near precision an antique firearm. For a device to be a replica firearm, it must meet all three requirements. A. It cannot be a firearm, meaning it does not discharge a projectile with sufficient energy to cause serious bodily injury or death to a person. If the device is a firearm, then it cannot be a replica firearm, and vice versa. So there again, this sort of reiterates what I'm talking about here. If the gun can cause serious injury or death if it fires something, it cannot be a replica. If it fires something but it has too low energy to cause serious injury or death, then it could be determined to be a replica. So B, it must resemble exactly or with near precision a real existing firearm or an identifiable make and model with respect to visual examination. Note the maximum observing distance is one at which the equivalent make and model of firearm can be identified. This distance will vary from one firearm make to the next. For example, a Luger pistol has a very distinct silhouette as compared to other makes and is therefore more readily identifiable from further away. The examination of the object is something more than casual but less than detailed. The device does not need to be so close that markings are identifiable, and C, it cannot be designed or intended to exactly resemble or to resemble with near precision an antique firearm. So a lot of gray area stuff in there. But the main point is here is if it looks like a specific make and model so close that it's hard to tell, then it could be considered a replica, and that's why a lot of the blank guns nowadays, at least in Canada, are not allowed to be imported, because I guess they fall into that sort of objectionable area where they've been determined to be too close looking to the real gun. Alright, we're going to move on now to the RCMP website, and this is a portion they have dedicated to air guns. And so this is going to go on for another page or so, but let's get into it because this sort of reiterates everything. This is the RCMP's, I guess what they've taken some information from the memorandum and they've sort of elaborated on it in their own way. So air guns that are firearms for the purpose of both the Firearms Act and the Criminal Code. These are air guns with both a high muzzle velocity, greater than 152.4 meters per second or 500 feet per second, and a high muzzle energy greater than 5.7 joules or 4.2 foot-pounds. The muzzle velocity is the speed of a projectile at the instant it leaves the muzzle of a gun, normally expressed in meters per second or feet per second. The muzzle energy is the energy of a projectile at the instant it leaves the muzzle of a gun, expressed in joules or foot-pounds. Airguns need to meet both standards to be classified as firearms for the purpose of the Firearms Act. Again, they have to meet both of them, which means they have to be able to shoot over 500 feet per second and over 5.7 joules. Not one or the other. Keep that in mind. These high-powered airguns are subject to the same license and registration requirements as a conventional firearm, so as a controlled firearm. Owners and users are also required to store, transport, display, and handle them safely in accordance with regulations supporting the Firearms Act. So if you have an air gun that is capable of shooting over 500 feet per second and at the same time over 5.7 joules of energy, then it could be considered a regulated or controlled firearm, and therefore you need to store it, transport it, and have all those things and be licensed to own and use it. Usually the manufacturer's specifications are used to determine what muzzle velocity and muzzle energy an airgun was designed to have. This information may be available in the user's manual or on the manufacturer's website. If the information is not available, individuals can call the Royal Canadian Mounted Police Canadian Firearms Program and ask to speak to the firearm technician to find out if the airgun is considered to be a firearm for the purpose of the Firearms Act. They should be more specific, controlled firearm. High-powered air rifles are generally classified as non-restricted firearms. However, the classification depends on the exact design of the airgun. Air rifles manufactured to resemble an assault rifle could be non-restricted, restricted, or prohibited depending on the exact model imitated. High-powered air rifles would also be prohibited firearms if fully automatic or if they have a sawed-off barrel. They could also be restricted firearms if they have a folding stock that reduces the overall length to less than 660 millimeters. So again, if the airgun can shoot over the uncontrolled specifications and gets into the controlled firearms category, it could be deemed to be either restricted if it has a short barrel, it could even be prohibited if it's fully automatic, or if it even looks a certain way. So in other words, we're not allowed to have AK-47 controlled firearms here in Canada. And our AR-15s are restricted, even though other very similar guns would be just non-restricted firearms here in Canada. So if they're uncontrolled, we can have all kinds of different things going on that our controlled guns are not allowed to have. So for instance, this PPS here, this guy right here, would be a prohibited firearm in Canada because it's got a short barrel. I wouldn't be able to actually own this or buy it because I just have my restricted firearms license, and because the barrel's too short, it falls into the prohibited category. which is something that you would have to have a grandfathered license. Nobody can get them new anymore. You have to actually have owned a short-barreled gun at the time that they changed that law. Similar to this gun here, short-barreled, it could, if it was considered to be a controlled firearm, it would be too short a barrel. Too short a barrel, here again, these would be prohibited firearms. Any of my BB guns that are fully automatic, if they were controlled, if they shot over that limitation, they would be considered prohibited firearms because we're not allowed to have fully automatic guns, or controlled guns I should say. So I think we've kind of gone over most of this stuff. Hopefully I've covered all your questions. I know it's been a hugely long video and hopefully I didn't miss anything. But I did want to mention this at the end here. Even though uncontrolled firearms are not governed by the Firearms Act, I should say the Controlled Firearms Act, and do not need to be handled or stored similarly in the same way you are required to handle, transport, and store a controlled firearm, we need to treat our air guns, airsoft guns, and blank guns, or our uncontrolled ones I should say, with care and go over and above what is expected when handling them, transporting them, and storing them. Alright, so let's be smart. Again, these guns look so realistic. If it looks like a gun, people are going to just assume it's a gun. And that could be anybody. That could be the person calling on the phone saying that some guy's shooting a real gun in his backyard when it just happens to be an air gun. Or you could be just cleaning it. You don't want to be that guy having the police called on you, or even worst case scenario, having the police shooting at you because they think you've got a real gun. It's a scary situation. So let's treat these things like they're real in most cases. Let's keep them out of sight when at all possible. Let's shoot them safe. Let's have a good time with them. Let's not ruin it for everybody else. Alright, thanks for watching another Replica Airguns video. Don't forget to subscribe. Check me out on Facebook and Twitter. Username is Replica Airguns. Also come on down to replicaairguns.com where I have posts, articles, reviews along with photos of a lot of these guns. And of course we have our US and Canada online Replica Airgun stores where we sell air guns, BB guns, blank guns, airsoft guns, knives, and other accessories. Thanks for watching. Until next time, take care.